Hi, this is Kowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at the role of labor, specifically in the southern colonies, starting with the headright system, followed by the indentured servitude, and then finally the inevitable African slaves that will be critical towards the commodities that are going to be produced in the southern colonies. So labor is certainly needed. If you recall, the Jamestown colony was not doing well until they found brown gold, aka tobacco. And of course, if you know anything about cultivating tobacco, it is extremely labor intensive. So essentially, the colonists were not accustomed to this hard work lifestyle, right? Back in England, they had more of a luxurious lifestyle, so they're not really accustomed to such hard work. So what Jamestown is going to do once they get through starving time and they're cultivating brown gold, if you will, with the help of John Rolfe, they're going to come up with this rather ingenious way to recruit more workers through what's called the headright system. So essentially anyone who could pay their own way to Virginia would get 50 acres of land. And this is, works to a certain extent as you're going to be able to lure more people to Jamestown. And, to an extent, yes, this is going to work. However, you have to keep in mind that this was only accessible and a little bit out of the means of the typical person. So you had to have a little bit of wealth. So there's going to be more ways of attaining people in labor to the colony. And this will then begin with indentured servants. And essentially how this worked was that you would get your passage paid to North America for free. Or really not so much for free, but in exchange rather for a limited term of servitude. So you'd receive your freedom after 4 to 7 years. You'll note that this does not last all that long. African slaves will come by 1619. And what's interesting to point out is that they did not come in rather as slaves yet. They were originally indentured servants. So they're not slaves right away. And this does not happen again until really the later 1600s. Of course, the Portuguese were the earliest of the slave traders, unlike other countries like British. The British will not get in on that right away. But slaves, keep in mind, are easier for indentured servants and eventually slaves because white people who were indentured servants could easily escape. You would have no way of identifying them. However, if by the skin color, you would be able to identify perhaps a runaway indentured servant from Africa or an escaped slave, so it's much easier to identify them. So certainly that's going to be much a little bit easier in that regard. So the English love the cash crop of tobacco. They're making a ton of money, from it, and they quickly forget that the Native Americans had helped them during starving time and ultimately allowed them to live. Without their assistance, certainly those colonists would have easily have died off. So now they have the audacity to not only to demand tribute, but also corn and labor from the Native Americans. And the soldiers are rather ruthless and say that their way of life and living, is the way to go. And keep in mind that, tobacco from their point of view, the British point of view, needs to be established. And they're going to not only, really ensure that the labor system is there, but they're also going to begin to impose this British North American culture of their own. And they're not going to be sharing in the wealth of this new society with the Native Americans. So really from an early onset, you have the basis of a racially based society, which we'll really get into in this screencast. You will see one in, South America and Spanish America, but it's much more fluid in the sense that you can move up it a little bit easier in comparison to British North America, where it's much more rigid of a social hierarchy. So certainly, the conflicts with the Native Americans sort of spells out these relations between the English and the natives for a very long time. And you'll have an all-out war by 1622. However, in 1619, just 3 years earlier, remember, Virginia is exporting about 1.5 million pounds of tobacco every year. That's quite impressive, but you have to also think at whose expense. And this will come at the expense of Native Americans. So you eventually had John Rolfe coming in, who will marry Pocahontas for some temporary peace. And certainly here you see Pocahontas in her Disney format. Really a more realistic depiction of her would be this picture on your right. But nevertheless, the Powhatans are eventually going to get fed up. They're going to launch an attack. And what happens here is, despite the fact that there was this attempt to marry for peace, this is very short-lived. And the king is going to say, we need to nip this in the bud, right? Tobacco is such a precious commodity. People in England are addicted to it. So he's now going to declare Virginia a royal colony. And this is important because now you're going to have a governor who reports directly back to the king, who's going to be imposing a much stricter control. And you'll also see that as a result, the population of the Powhatans and the Native Americans is going to decline. So eventually, as these Powhatan numbers are falling, you're bringing in indentured servants and then eventually slaves. But I want to focus your attention to this childlike drawing here. And it's going to really depict a problem that's going to lead to Bacon's rebellion and a social hierarchy based on race. In the central location, you have the rich landowners. On the outer edges, you have the poor landowners who might be able to own a slave, maybe one or two. You also have indentured servants. You also have some settlers who are black, so they're not enslaved yet. And then you have Native Americans on the very outer edge who are constantly being pushed off the land. But this is going to create a powder keg of violence. So by 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, wants to take things into his own hand. He raises an army, and of course, you're going to have violence erupting. And he's going to lead this rebellion against the Native Americans, who he's going to defeat. And he's also going to perhaps go after the wealthy landowners. But the wealthy landowners, of course, aren't going to have it. But they do notice one interesting thing, that Bacon is able to unite both black and white poor landowners. Again, we do not have slaves really at this point yet. So they see that these poor black and white landowners are uniting against common threats. So the landowners were like, how do we split them apart? Well, you do this by developing codes and laws which solidify a racial hierarchy. And this is going to eventually bring about British North American slavery, where you're going to have a hierarchy now based on race. So these poor landowners are going to be now divided amongst race, so that, and again, this is purposely done by the wealthy landowners in order to ensure that the white landowners are not always, uniting with the black ones. They're going to say, hey, we're better because of our race. And it's sort of the sick ploy, if you will, to sort of get the attention off of the rich landowners and have the poor white landowners focus that more on the black poor landowners, if that makes sense. So here you see a bigger depiction of it. I would certainly make note of this. So certainly with the development of the racial hierarchy, you're going to see that a good number of people are coming into the English colonies. You're going to have certainly immigration of men, women, and even families. However, you don't really see much intermarriage or relations with natives or the Africans either. Now you are going to see that the headright system is going to encourage more immigrants, since landowners would receive a good amount of land, but still you're going to have Native Americans being seen as these savages. This is just going to help solidify this racial hierarchy as you're getting more and more white people into British North America. So with this, it's going to bring about the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade. With the amount of land in British North America, as well as how inexpensive it relatively was for people of some means who could afford the passage, it makes it so that agriculture is the place or the type of industry that you want to be in to make money. And with mercantilism, colonists there, of course in British North America, are making the raw materials to export to the mother country. And this again will lead to the perfect storm in the Atlantic slave trade. Keep in mind, of course, slaves will be taken all over North and South America, but in comparison to the number of slaves in South America, you don't actually have that many going actually to North America relative to South America. I'll blow up this in a moment, this picture. And again, look at this. You have about 500,000 going to North America, but really in the West Indies, you have 4.5 million, 5 million going into South America. So really the bulk of slaves are really going in Central and South America as opposed to North America. And again, there were some reasons for this. It was harder to enslave Native Americans, particularly in South America. They knew the land, whereas Africans did not. They're coming to a foreign land. They're immune to some of these European diseases. But again, the numbers are very, very stark, as you can see. So slavery in British America, of course, it is based on racial superiority. Even children of slaves are going to become slaves. There used to be this idea that the freeing of slaves, would be done after a set number of years. However, with the British, they do not really abide by this particular idea. They did not care if slaves had to be broken up amongst families. And, slaves in the New World are going to try to form networks and sort of be, quote unquote, surrogate relatives. But again, the brutality of slavery is very much illustrated, especially this racial hierarchy. So, for example, you see these slaves who are barely clothed, if not even clothed, protecting this white landowner from the hot sun. So again, you just see this illustrated just in this depiction alone. But ultimately, it's important to note that there is some resistance from slaves that was often very covert. This is stuff that isn't going to make newspaper headlines because it's rather covert. It was done more subtly. So you see things like working slowly, faking illness, running away, breaking tools. It's not going to catch the attention of big newspapers, such as like the Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina, where you're going to have lots of people killed. You're going to have, these slaves hoping to escape to Spanish Florida, where they might find a home within the Seminole Indians. It's really not quite the same, but this is passive resistance day after day. But it's important to note that the anti-slavery movement was also written through words from the get-go, and you'll see this in period 2 quite a lot. There's a lot of early predecessors of what would become abolitionist writers using religiously based arguments to explain why slavery was an evil institution, why it should be cast aside, why it was just no good. And you see this with the Germantown protest, which was written by Quaker converts in 1688. So you already have people coming out against slavery. And this is the first known petition written decrying the brutality of slavery in British North America. Even in the 1700s, you have the selling of Joseph. Samuel Sewell, who is this magistrate who will preside during the Salem witch trials, who will later apologize for his role, but he did rather this uncomplicated argument based on religion against slavery. So you see the influence of religion coming out rather early in coming into effect of the early arguments against slavery. So slavery is developing quite early, as well as the resistance. While it will take a good amount of time until we get to the Civil War and you begin to see states, and especially in the North, begin to outlaw slavery, it will take some time, but there is resistance already mounting. So you could almost say that the Civil War in some ways has roots already in 1688. So this is a very important document to be aware of.